Hello.
How's it going?
Good. How are you?
Not too bad, not too bad.
Good. Wait for a few people to see who shows up before we start. So we'll probably wait until about at least 5 after, and then we'll sort of revisit this. So just hang out for a bit, okay?
Okay.
What are you doing, goofball? Okay. Stop it, Lucy. I'm going to go get my charge cord, and I'll be back. Right. Please be quiet, Lucy. All right. Hi, everybody. I'll go ahead and, can you hear me okay? Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Okay. All right, so decided to sit on one of my couches in my office area, and I have headphones on. If you hear some loud noises, it's probably outside. We have some people here that are lifting up our house. Part of our house has a little bit of sinking, so I apologize in advance. And if it becomes annoying, just let me know. They aren't quite doing it yet. They're about to start. I honestly didn't think they were going to come because of, you know, everything that's happening. So I was kind of surprised when they knocked on my door this morning. But anyway, so let's see. So if you look at the whatchamacallit, Blackboard, you'll see that I'm bringing in again an outside chapter because your book kind of doesn't do a fabulous job about really digging into authoritarian institutions. Okay, and I think we kind of really need to talk about that separately. So I'm taking a quick break to do that. So I posted the PDFs for that chapter so that you can read at your leisure. And of course, you know, for the final to pick out those terms and, you know, all of that. But anyway, so, oops, hold on. All right. So this is going to be kind of hard with this thing. So some of the questions that we would ask when we're thinking about these authoritarian institutions are that some authoritarian regimes disperse power more widely than others. So we want to know, how would comparatives determine who rules in authoritarian regimes and what limits executive power there are in an authoritarian regime, right? So at the level of the executive, what are those limits on power? Who has, you know, the right to limit those powers, et cetera, right? So authoritarian regimes come in several different subtypes: military, one party, theocratic, personalist, electoral authoritarian. So we want to know, in what ways do differences across these subtypes explain differences in leaders' actions, levels of oppression, types of popular participation, right? So not only are there multiple types of authoritarian regimes, right, like those listed there, but, you know, authoritarian regimes, kind of like I've alluded to in the past, they all don't look alike, right? So authoritarianism doesn't look the same in Saudi Arabia as it does, say, in Russia. It doesn't look the same as it does in Syria. They all sort of exist on a sliding scale. Repression might be limited to some extent because perhaps they're trying to buttress certain types of legitimacy and different things like that, you know, for various reasons. And so we want to know why that would be in certain types of regimes, right? So what is clientelism? Well, what is it? they don't really say that there, but why is clientelism so prevalent and important in authoritarian regimes? And in what sense, wait, I should probably have my glasses on. In what types of authoritarian regimes does it seem most important, and what might explain this? Right? So why is it that in certain types of authoritarian regimes, people will do things like play for pay, right? Create, sorry, my dog is distracting me, relationships where people will, um, pay off politicians and stuff like that, right? And what types of relationships do they form, right? And why? Some authoritarian regimes allow at least some institutionalized limits on rulers' power. What explains where and why this happens or doesn't happen, right? So it kind of goes to the first question, right? So again, all regimes are not the same, okay? So some do have limits on the executive. Some constrain their executive in certain ways. Where are those types of limitations? Who creates those limitations? And why do those limitations exist, right? So these are the types of things that we kind of are curious about in relation to authoritarian regimes. So authoritarian rule around the world. So we kind of talked about this in the past, right? That authoritarian regimes started to peak around the 1970s, okay? And then they started to decline at the end of the Cold War, but to about 40% of countries in 2008. But if you look at Freedom House, we're starting to see lots of democratic countries backslide towards authoritarianism, right, which is a big concern. Countries like Hungary, right, that were once democracy, lots of countries in Eastern Europe, these former post-communist countries, and Poland. It's getting kind of scary about the condition in Poland. So, we're a little bit worried about that. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. I keep touching it by mistake. See if we can look at it like this. Okay, so again, like I said, not all authoritarian regimes are alike. They have just as much variation and diversity as democratic regimes, all right? And electoral authoritarian regimes are more common since the end of the Cold War. So you'll have a lot more regimes that are, we used to call them, ironically, electoral democracies, right? So it was sort of a patronymic, right? Like you would, or an honorific, really, I guess you would say, where you would say, well, this country is moving towards a democracy. So like we used to call Russia a electoral democracy, right? Because they were making strides towards democracy, right? And we wanted to kind of give them the benefit of the doubt, right? And so we would say, okay, well, they're, not quite there yet, but, they claim they want to be a democracy and they're moving in that direction, right? But we realized we had to stop calling them that, right? And so now we call these regimes electoral authoritarian regimes, right? Because the only strapping of, that they have of democracy really is that they hold elections, right? They may not even really be free and fair, okay? But they just hold some kind of election, right? So these types of regimes are more common. They might have some hybrid, uh, um, feature to it, right? But we'll talk more about that. Oops, hold on. Push the wrong button here. So, forms of authoritarian regimes. Before I go on, does anybody know why I have a picture here, this picture here like this? Anybody? Anybody know who this is?
Yeah, is that the president of China?
Yeah. Do you know why I
They
have
said
this?
that he looks like Winnie the Pooh. Yeah,
Yeah. Exactly. So that was like a big thing.
they did a
Uh,
South Park episode with that.
right, exactly. And
Yeah,
so he got really angry about it, apparently. And so, like, Winnie the Pooh was apparently banned, I guess, in China or something like this because of it. It's
yeah, they
like,
banned it in China. Yeah,
right, it's like completely crazy. So I just put that there because China's the perfect example of a one party system, right? And so it's just kind of funny. Just sort of needle, Xi, but anyway, so one party system, China, right? They're communist. Well, they claim to be communist, okay, but it's quite clear now that they've pretty much all but abandoned their Marxist-Leninist Maoist philosophy because they are pursuing free market capitalism, right? They do have, um, they claim that they follow, Maoist, Marxist, Leninist ideology, but really um, they're more of a modernizing authoritarian regime, which is where they are modernizing their country, right? And sort of consolidating regime power. Um, but, that doesn't really have anything to do necessarily with communism, right? Russia, right now, under Putin, is also modernizing authoritarian, right? And they're not communist. So it's, whatever. But anyway, uh, one party regimes also tend to be nationalist. Okay. They can either be nationalist or communist, or they could be both. Right. So um, then you have military. That's another example. Um, Personalist regimes, semi-authoritarian. Sometimes they can be a combination, right? So you can have a one-party personalist regime. You can have a personalist military regime. You can have a semi-authoritarian personalist regime, different things like that. They tend to mix, most common with personalist, right? But you can have some combination of these um, types of regimes, okay? Just keep that in mind. So having a supreme leader is key, right? So um, this is an individual who wields executive power with few formal limits in an authoritarian regime. That's the definition of a supreme leader, okay? And they rule through a combination of repression, co-option, and efforts at legitimation. And what that means is that they're typically using repression, um, efforts to co-opt the opposition, okay, uh, in order to gain some sense of legitimation for their rule, okay? Um, and so, and they have to sort of balance that, right? If they do too much repression, then they're not necessarily going to be seen as legitimate, right? Which could be a problem. Now, if they have lots of resources, say like Saudi Arabia, right, it may be less of a concern, right? Because then they're wholly independent and they don't really care so much, right? Um, so, uh, but they still may need to co-opt opposition, right? Because they don't want to get overthrown or something like this, right? Because there still may be that kind of concern, right? But if they don't have resource curse, then they're going to have to sort of balance the amount of repression, still have to co-op because there's always that concern of being overthrown, right? To try and co-opt the opposition, et cetera, to maintain their sense of being legitimate, right? Because if you remember going back to the modern state, right? maintaining regime strength and regime legitimacy is very important to the modern state. And if you are seen as being illegitimate, then you are going to have weak internal sovereignty, right? And so it's going to be difficult for you to maintain power, right? And so that's kind of what this is talking about, right? So, as I said, they are going to have some supreme leader, and they'll call it different things. Sometimes they'll call it supreme leader, okay? Sometimes they'll call them the Ayatollah, or, whatever, as they do in Iran, or, maybe they'll call him president, like here this says, Putin, you're not my president, right? Putin's called a president, okay? So whatever, doesn't matter. Governing institutions, again, military, they're all going to have some sort of military and security forces, okay? These are always going to be key players in any authoritarian regime, okay? They are going to be also a threat to the ruling elite, okay? So every regime relies on repression, and of course it's going to be the military, right, that is going to supply that repression, okay? They're going to be the ones that, round up people that need to be round up, that are the muscle for any protests, if things get out of hand, right, and the police can't handle it, right, as part of security forces or whatever. If it gets, too far out of hand, they'll call in the tanks or whatever, right? Of course, they're also going to have spy networks that are comprised of both military and civilian networks. So like, in Russia, it's like the FSB, but then they also have, that's the civilian arm, but then they also have the GRU, which is the military spies, right? So they gather intelligence, right? And they want to know who is, excuse me, just one second. Of course, they want to know who is opposed to the regime, right? And they do this in an attempt to overcome what's known as the dictator's dilemma, right? So the dictator's dilemma is when a dictator, because they're always ruling through repression in some way, shape, or form, they don't ever really know how much support they really have, right? So they're always having to compensate for that in some kind of way. Okay. Right. So here's the definition. So the definition: repression creates fear, which then breeds to uncertainty about how much support the ruler has, right? So basically, when you're ruling by repression all the time, people are scared, right? Kind of like how what we were talking about in the last chapter about differential item functioning, right? So like if people were to come and like survey and stuff, you're less likely to get honest answers, right? Because people are scared, okay? And it's kind of the same thing, right? So because people are scared, a dictator is not always going to know how the citizenry really feels about them, okay? And so as a result of that, the dictator doesn't really know where the true level of support, okay? And so the opposition, right, will ultimately tend to be more secretive, right? So they'll find ways to, do things like send coded messages, try to go underground, do whatever it is that they need to do, right? And so this ends up creating a situation where the dictator will have to spend lots more money, okay, and resources than would be rational in order to co-opt the opposition, okay, because they just they're clueless. They don't have enough information to go on as far as, because they don't know how the populace itself is really feeling, right? Even with all their vast buy networks and all of this stuff, because citizens hold so much, tightly, right? Especially depending upon the level of repression in a state, right? So they may know they have opposition, but they don't know what the tipping point of their citizenry is for revolution, or to agree to, go with an opposition leader, right? So anyway, so legislatures and parties, these were created to help overcome the dictator's dilemma. So in a way, they allow opposition to voice their opinions, and this will help the dictator to gain information, right? So these various people who are in the opposition, they can, they will perhaps at some point out themselves, or, might through legislation or whatever, or through an opposition party or something, um, voice whatever, right? And so if the dictator, lets up the reins a little bit, right, and gives the opposition a little bit of breathing room, right, then perhaps he or she would be able to know where, the where their enemies are, right, and how the public actually feels, right? So it's sort of like a two-pronged like attack, right? So you let the people sort of voice their opinion through parties, through their legislatures, right? And but it's a very delicate balancing act, right? Because if you give the opposition too much power, you can create a tipping point, right, where um, the where the opposition can take over and gain too much power and gain control, right? This is most susceptible in personalist regimes. Okay, and a personalist regime is basically where, all the power is rested in like one individual, right? So like where there's a cult of personality around that person, okay, and there isn't like a strong base of regime support like in a party, or the regime itself, right? But it's just in like one person, okay, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. Right, so when the opposition is united, right, and once there's like, even if it's the balance of power, if the opposition has just as much power as the regime, then that will cause them to topple, right? So does anybody know who is in this picture by chance? Anyone? I see someone in the text thing. Hold on. Chat. Yes, Cameron. Perfect. Do you know who is with him? That's Erdogan, president of Turkey. Anybody know who is in the picture with him? Hi, Yash.
Hey, what's up?
Good. Nothing much. So do we know who's in the picture with Erdogan there?
No, is that like a general, one of his generals?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So I will slaughter his name, so I'm not going to attempt to say it. but it was his like number one general, like I think of the army, right? And they were like very close, supposedly. But in the coup that happened a couple years back, now hold on, why is this not popping up? Hold on. I thought that this was just, oh, because the thing is in the way. Hold on. Let me move your pretty little faces for just a second. So there was a coup that happened like a couple years ago, right? And this was like the craziest thing. So Erdogan, there was a coup that happened against him, right? And I don't think he was in town. Like the information is kind of vague, right? And it happened in the middle of the night, and the military sort of like, I guess, took power, right? And it looked like they were like gonna like take over, right? Because Erdogan started taking a bunch of dictatorial powers, right? It was like a military coup, and they seemed to like be winning this thing, right? And then all of a sudden, hold on. All of a sudden, Erdogan calls, literally picks up his iPhone, calls one of the TV stations, right, in Istanbul, and gets on YouTube. Like, not YouTube, I mean, but like she gets on FaceTime. And the broadcaster shows him on FaceTime, and he's like, all those people who are doing this coup, this is a coup, and I am still in control of this country, and all of those people, they are going to get themselves in trouble, and they are traitors to this country, and blah 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 blah. And she was like, and it was the craziest thing. Hold on, I know it is on YouTube. And they're going, when he was on the phone. Wait, call in, maybe. Call in a TV station. Turkey president. Yeah, here we go. Here, hold on. What? Well, where is it? Aren't you going to show it? You're just going to talk to her? Oh, come on. Okay, that's not helpful. All right, hold on. I'm going to Google it because it's on here somewhere. Coup attempt phone in. It's crazy. Yeah, here we go. Hold on. Now, gotta share my screen. Yes, share desktop. Share. Okay. I can't really understand what he's saying, but you could still see. Look at, you can barely even see him. Someone else just try to call. Anyway, we can't really understand what he's saying, but he does say, he's like, you know, this is a coup and blah, 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 and yada, 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 right? And so that is how he stopped the coup. I mean, that's like crazy, right? I mean, hold on. No.
Reporter's face is so funny.
I know. I know. She's like, you know, I mean, what was she gonna do though? You know, it's kind of like, you know, hold on. Nope, that's not the right PowerPoint. Where is it? Hold on. Yeah, I mean, it was kind of, you know, a strange situation to be in. Nope. Hold on, PowerPoint. Yes, this one, Microsoft PowerPoint. You know, it was kind of a strange position to be in, I guess, you know, for her. Wait, share Microsoft PowerPoint, share. Okay, but the coup was led by this guy, right? And, you know, they were winning, right? And then once that aired, just the like lower soldiers, right? The just infantry guys, you know, the grunts, they started to just sort of peel away because they got scared and they lost their resolve, right? And so just, you know, just started to fall apart, right? And so then Erdogan regained control of the military and then arrested those people who took part, right? And arrested this guy. And, you know, I mean, I guess you could say this for Erdogan. He didn't kill this guy. He's rotting in prison somewhere, right, in Chile. I mean, not Chile, Turkey. You know, so I guess there's that. You know, I mean, if he was in Saudi Arabia, he'd be beheaded by now or killed with a bone saw or something. But anyway, so it's just kind of interesting, I guess. But anyway, so hold on, I gotta move you guys so I can see. Okay. So other institutions, they also will have things like a judiciary, right? So typically authoritarian rules rulers will allow for some form of a judiciary, and how they work um, is going to vary, of course, by authoritarian regime. So they will usually allow some form of rule of law, right? So typically they will allow things like, for the common person, things might be able to function somewhat well. I mean, in a functioning authoritarian regime, mind you, okay, where the judiciary sort of functions, the average person could expect that if they have some sort of problem with their neighbor, like, they get into a dispute about, you know, um, land borders, or if, say, someone stole from them, or if, somebody was murdered or something like that, they could expect fair trials. Okay. Um, but typically, you're not going to be able to expect a fair trial in relation to anything political, right? Now, in the functioning authoritarian regimes, they will, of course, allow, the reason why they will provide, uh, this sort of functioning rule of law for the average person is because it helps buttress their sense of legitimacy, right? It gives the average person this sense of security, right? That they're sort of, that their everyday lives are sort of functioning in a normal way, right? And so long as they just don't get mixed up with the political stuff, right, then they're fine. Okay. And so in a sense, it buttresses their sense of legitimacy, right? But it's once you cross that political line, then you start to have problems, right? So the problem, of course, is there are those authoritarian regimes that don't even provide that level of judiciary protection, right? Where in some, the judiciary is for sale to the highest bidder, right? So that's where you're going to see weak bureaucracy in that regard, and decreased sense of legitimacy for the rulers, right? So bureaucracy, again, it's kind of like what I was just talking about. It's really a question of institutional strength, right? Weak bureaucracy is going to create patronage, again, kind of like what I'm talking about, who's for sale to the highest bidder, right? Opportunities for the supreme leader can be used to co-opt opponents, right? So when you're talking about the bureaucracy, right, the supreme leader can say, all right, you know, what can I do to get you to be over on my side? And someone might say, well, I'd like a ministry position, a cabinet position, or whatever, right? And this happens a lot in personalist regimes, especially. Um, Sometimes they'll end up, putting somebody in a position that, they don't really have any right to be in, right? They have no sort of technocratic ability, right? Also, you'll see in personalist regimes that people will, the supreme leader will often put their family in those types of positions too, that often don't have any technocratic ability to put them in, right? And so they will often have weak bureaucracies. In the best case, when you're talking about these sort of patronage type situations, the supreme leader will, if smart, try to put some of these people in positions that at least match something that they might know about, right? But that doesn't always happen, as you can imagine. Of course, the degree of institutionalization really matters when you're talking about bureaucracy. How strong are the various institutions, right? If they're strong and they're functioning, you're going to have a stronger state, right? A stronger authoritarian state. Just like with any state, right? A democracy too. If you have stronger bureaucracies, right? Functioning institutions within the bureaucracy, then you're going to have a more stable democratic regime. It's the same thing with authoritarians, right? If you have functioning institutions that are stable, etc., then you're going to have a more stable authoritarian regime, right? So, let's see, problems of succession. Communist regimes choose, this shouldn't really be kind of like that though. So communist regimes choose new leaders from among key contenders within the Politburo. Hold on a second. It's my husband. Hold on. I got to make sure it's nothing important because he had an appointment, doctor's appointment. Hello, I'm teaching. Okay. Anyway, let's see. So a Politburo is this sort of elite group within the party, right? They're sort of like the upper echelon, right? And so they will choose who will lead the party, okay? So let's see. Generally, personalist leaders tend to rule for life, okay? Blah, blah, blah. And you can get into an issue if a successor isn't named, right? Does anybody know who this is in this picture? Anyone?
Is that Stalin?
Yes, that's Stalin. That's a young Stalin.
Yeah, I studied a lot of Russia in school. We did a lot of Russian and German history.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, that's young Stalin. They had to lighten up the picture from his arrest and because it was a lot darker, but yeah, that's a young Stalin in 1901 when he was busted for revolutionary activity. But anyway, so Stalin is this sort of prime example of being a personalist regime, right? In fact, it was Nikita Khrushchev who was the premier of the Soviet Union after Stalin, who coined the term cult of personality, right? And that is a phenomena that occurs by definition in the most extreme cases of personalist rule, in which followers constantly glorify the ruler and attempt to turn his every utterance into not only government fiat, but divine wisdom. So, like, this is, where basically you turn the leader into almost like a demigod, right? Where everything this person does, everything that they say, everything that they do, just the sun rises and sets upon them, right? And you can't imagine the country being run without them, this sort of thing, right? And this was a big problem um, uh, with the death of Stalin, right? And like seriously, like when he died, um, thousands upon thousands, like throngs and throngs of people came to his funeral, right? And, you know, hundreds upon hundreds of people died in a stampede to try to see his body. People were wailing and crying and, you know, oh my God, like they could not imagine what they were going to do, you know, blah, blah, blah. And it took Nikita Khrushchev to, you know, kind of throw cold water like on the country, slap them a few times and wake them up about this cult of personality and what happened and about what a monster Stalin had become. And, you know, they went through this period of de-Stalinization is what it was referred to, right? And they had to understand that in the Soviet Union, that they could no longer allow this personality cult to be formed around any one person ever again because of the problem of succession, right? Because there was a period after his death where there was this struggle for power. And of course, because of the problems within society that it created, right? And so they decided that they were going to move away from that and reinvest power back into the party versus allowing it to go to any one person, right? Because it was just too damaging. Um, because obviously, I mean, look at everything that Stalin did with the various purges, the Holodomor in Ukraine, where 6 million people were starved to death between 1928 and 1932, you know, between Ukraine and southern Russia. And the collectivization, and through the collectivization of the farms, and you know, and then the also the deportation of all Chechen and Ingush peoples to Dagestan because he thought that they were all Nazi collaborators, and half the population of Chechen people died in that process, literally half of them, until and they stayed gone until Khrushchev repatriated them back to Chechnya. I mean, it's just horrible, the things that were going on. You know, and Khrushchev let all the people out of the gulags and all of that kind of stuff. So anyway, so China, they are an example of a modernizing authoritarian rule, right? So regime type, we talked about this, one party, they're modernizing authoritarian. The form of repression, it's primarily aimed at regime opponents. They now also include Muslim minorities in China, the Uyghurs, right? They use massive oppression in relation to them and other minority groups. And of course, any political opponents, right? Co-option, they tend to use patronage and corruption opportunities within the party and government. Okay. Institutionalization, that's greatly increased in top leadership, judiciary, civilian control of the military. Succession, now it's like, it used to be that it was regularized and signal in advance within the ruling party elite, but right now Xi has just changed everything over to he's president for life. So I suppose once he's, you know, kicked the bucket, they'll, you know, signal for somebody else within the party. So I guess it's no longer really regularized in the typical sense that it used to be. I guess it's now regularized in the sense that once the president kicks the bucket, that, you know, they find somebody else, right? So Iran is really an interesting case. They are an electoral authoritarian regime because they have this dual system of democracy and theocracy, right? And we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. Hold on, I should probably hold on. Should put this here and this here. Okay. So regime type, it's theocracy, electoral authoritarianism, like I was talking about, repression. They have the supreme leader, right, the Ayatollah, and they're able to eliminate political oppression when necessary via the Guardian Council, which we'll talk about in just a second. The Revolutionary Guard, that's the elite military unit that's loyal to the Ayatollah, right? So a lot of times the supreme leader will have a elite military guard that is dedicated to them, okay? And Iran is no different. That's the Revolutionary Guard. So, oh God, why am I blanking? I can't believe I'm blanking on his name. I can see his face. Hold on. This is just so ridiculous. Yeah, Qassam Soleimani. Gosh, I can't believe I forgot his name. Yeah, so Qassam Soleimani, that guy that we killed in January, right? He was a member of the Revolutionary Guard, right? Their former president before Hassan Rouhani, who is why am I forgetting everybody's name? Ahmadinejad, he was a member of the Revolutionary Guard. So the Revolutionary Guard is very important in Iran. So they help sort of keep the regime in power, right? And of course, the judiciary also helps with this. So co-option, they have patronage via the Islamic foundations. I think I've talked to you guys a little bit about this, the Islamic foundations. They're really interesting. Typically, they're often used as this sort of like big savings fund for things like if there's national disasters like earthquakes that tend to happen a lot in Iran, or famines, or anything like that that might transpire. They get the money obviously from oil, right? And they put a bunch of money into the Islamic foundations, and they very generously give money to people that are starving, or need homes rebuilt, or whatever, right, from the Islamic foundations. But at the same time, they will say if the Revolutionary Guard is getting antsy, and they feel like they might be plotting some sort of like coup or something like that, they'll take money from that and give money to the Revolutionary Guards to like give them new uniforms, or to buy them all cars, or up their pay or something like this, right? And they have so much money in these Islamic foundations that it's like nothing. So it's like the Islamic foundations do double duty in that regard. Okay. Institutionalization. The theocratic institutions are always more powerful in relation to the quasi-democratic ones. So we'll talk a little bit about how the democratic ones function in a second. So hold on to that thought, okay? succession. The selection process for a supreme leader amended to allow political astute choice. So what that means is, like when the first Ayatollah died, right? Because the revolution happened in 1979, and when the first Ayatollah died in the 80s, right? They realized, and he was like a big deal, right? And they realized that they could run into this issue of personalist, rule, and they decided they needed to cut that right in the bud. Right. So they decided to write into their laws of secession in relation to the Ayatollah that the Ayatollah didn't have to be the one that had the most religious training, was the, most pious, or the, whatever. Okay. But that instead, that the one that was going to be chosen as Ayatollah would be the one who was most suited for the job from a political standpoint, the one who seemed to be able to, who was savvy, who, seemed to be amiable and, meet all these various qualities for the job itself, right? Not necessarily from a theocratic position, right? Of course, they needed to come up from the religious arm, right? But they didn't have to be, the most know-it-all, right, of the religious group, right? Just the one that seemed best fitted for the role, okay? And the president, because again, remember, they have this democratic arm, they have a democratically elected president that's elected to a 4-year term. Okay, and we'll talk more about that in just a second, and we'll talk more about this institutionalization thing in just a second. So this case of Iran, elections, again, they have a presidential and they have presidential and legislative arms. The Guardian Council has control of candidate selection. So this is kind of, and it's in that PDF from the book, right? This is kind of what it looks like, right? So essentially what you have up here is the supreme leader, right? And then you have this assembly of experts, okay? This is 86 religious scholars, all right? They're popularly elected to 8-year terms, right? This is the Guardian Council of Guardians, right? They consist of 12-member board, 6 clerics chosen by the supreme leader, and 6 jurists recommended by the judiciary, okay? And so it's the Guardian Council that picks, so this is the way it works. So say you want to run for president, right? And you, you decide you want to run for president, you submit your name, or you decide you want to run for the legislature, or whatever. You submit your name to the Guardian Council, okay? And they will look through the candidates and they sort of like weed it out. Hold on. Yash, hold on. Yes, Yash, that does explain a lot about Chechnya. And we'll talk about that actually a little bit later, I think in the next chapter. No, not the next chapter. The chapter after this, in 2 chapters. So hold that thought, because when we talk in the next chapter, 2 chapters more about authoritarianism, we're going to talk a little bit more about Russia, in the case of Russia, and like the Chechen wars. We'll talk about that. Okay. So anyway, so they will sort of like weed out some of the candidates, right? And then, but from that point, and so the 6 clerics and the 6 judiciary people, the 6 judiciary people are non-theocracy people types, right? So they're just like, oh, I didn't mean to flip you guys off. They're civilians, okay? So they weed out those people, And then from that point on, it's a completely democratic process. The people choose, and the winner literally takes it. It's popular vote. There isn't, another layer or anything like that, right? So, and the winner of the popular vote always takes that position. Okay, so there's never been a time where the winner of the popular vote was overruled by the supreme leader or any of that, right? So anyway, let's see. All right, go back. So parties. Parties used to be banned, right? The supreme leader thought, particularly within the presidency, that there should be no leaders. But now parties are back, but they're very weak. Okay. They just seem to create this sort of factionalist sort of air, and people generally don't like parties and around. Okay. So civil society is getting stronger, all right, especially now. But there was a green movement in 2009, right? That was a women's movement. Uh, that was when President Ahmadinejad was in charge. He's the guy that used to wear like members only jackets. It's kind of funny because this guy, President Rouhani, right? You see him a lot around right now, and he dresses like very conservatively, but he's actually comparatively pretty liberal. Right? But like Ahmadinejad, he would wear like black jeans and like black sneakers or whatever, and like this brown members only jacket, right? And basically like civilian clothes. But he was like really conservative, not necessarily from a theocratic point, but because he was from the Revolutionary Guard, but from an authoritarian military type point. He was very very authoritarian. But so when the Green Movement happened, this women's movement, women seeking more rights, right? He really came down very hard on them, Ahmadinejad. And the word is apparently, before this, in Iran, people were starting to wonder, like what is going on, because Ahmadinejad was kind of like rubbing up against the Ayatollah. And it seemed like the Revolutionary Guard was starting to kind of pull away some from the Ayatollah and getting closer to Ahmadinejad. And remember, Ahmadinejad was a member of the Revolutionary Guard, right? And so people are like, what is going on here? Like people that are Iran experts, right? And it seemed like there was some sort of power shift that was occurring, and people were wondering, like, how much longer is this going to go on? Like, what's happening here, right? Is the presidency really more independent from the Ayatollah? Like, what's happening? Then the Green Movement happened, and he came down really hard on the women, and the Ayatollah apparently used that as an opportunity to sort of bring down the hammer and say, you're being too rough, but then also to sort of rein in, um, Ahmadinejad, right? And to sort of put an end to his nonsense, right? And he just sort of got rid of him. I mean, not killed him or not got rid of him, but like, just sort of neutralized his power, right? And then the next time, Rouhani, who knew the Ayatollah from back in the revolutionary days, right, ran. And it was interesting because, Rouhani has a PhD in constitutional law, I think from like University of Glasgow or something like that, from Scotland, right? And he used to, work in like the nuclear something or other, I don't know, um, in the legal aspect of it, right? In Iran for many years. But so he runs for president, and the Ayatollah had to have known, right, that Rouhani is much more liberal, right? So it's interesting that the Guardian Council did not filter his name out, right? And he won. And, as tough as things are in Iran, a lot has changed in the condition for women, for example, in Iran. Women have shorter sleeves, they're pulling their hijabs back further, they're wearing much more color. Women are getting, government contracts, for um, architectural stuff and scientific stuff and things that have never like really happened before. Um, and things are happening. Of course, they're not happening at the level that the world would like them to be, but things are happening in ways that they haven't happened before there. And that's a good thing, obviously, right? But, only so much can happen, and the theocratic arm is always pushing against it. It's kind of like in the United States, right? You have the hardliners, right? They're always pushing against those who want to see more progressive change, right? And it's no different in Iran. It's not just the Ayatollah. There are hardlining factions within the Iranian government, within either the Guardian Council or within the legislature, et cetera, that are always grinding and pushing, like with the nuclear deal. The hardliners wanted no part of it. They did not want to sign it. They wanted, because they didn't trust the United States. They were like, okay, Obama's trustworthy, but who's the next president gonna be? Right? That person's, probably not gonna live up to it, or maybe they won't, or down the road, or, whatever. We can't trust the Americans, Um, and well, here we are, right? And we had hardliners in America that were like, we can't trust the Iranians and blah, 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 right? So it's a very similar dynamic in a lot of ways, right? But anyway, so um, this is sort of the structure of the Iranian government. They have a parliament, they have a Supreme Court, they have, obviously the voters, they vote on the president, they vote on the assembly of experts, um, and all of that. Okay, so if you're interested, this is kind of what it looks like. They're sort of dual system, and that's why we talk about that Iran is an electoral authoritarian regime, because they have a lot of trappings of democracy, which people don't really realize. They allow for lots of different kinds of participation, for people to protest, to vote, and their vote actually does matter. It is recognized, etc. Right? So that's why they're considered an electoral authoritarian regime. So leaders can't rule by repression alone, right? When you're talking about elections, a lot of times they'll have demonstrations of mass support. And we call this the banality of power. Okay. So you see images like this from like the old Soviet Union. You'll see it, these vast grand military parades, right? This is typically a common trapping of military authoritarian regimes, or, some combination thereof, right? And they do this because they are concerned about, okay, it goes back to the dictator's dilemma, right? They don't know how much power they really have, right? Um, and, uh, you know, So what they need to do is they need to put on these grand displays of power. And it has a couple of benefits to the leader, right? One, they get to show off to their people and to the world, right, all of the toys that they have, right? And it's kind of like a, you know, me, don't mess with me kind of thing, right? But it also is a signal to the people, right? It's a form of like passive aggressive repression, right? Like, if you mess with me, I can turn this all around on you, right? So it signals back to the people the power of the state, right? So there's that too. So blah, blah, blah. Sometimes in extreme cases, you'll have limited elections and opposition parties, right? Especially if they're like single party regimes, you're not going to have an opposition party and stuff like that, right? One party regimes will allow internal elections. You know, communist regimes, basically your election is to, my mic is wigging out. Okay. Is it better now? Okay.
Could you just repeat that last part a little bit?
Let me go back. So so when you have these demonstrations of mass support, right, they do it in part to not only show the world all the power that they have, right? Look at all my toys, right? And if you mess with me, I'm going to use them on you, okay? But they also show them, hold on, it's saying my internet is unstable. But they also are using them to kind of like show the power of the state to the people and say, look, we can turn this back on you. So if you try to betray us, if you're a traitor, we will turn this power back on you. So it's a form of threat. It's a form of oppression, repression, right? It's to instill fear in the people as well. Do you know what I mean? So did you guys get that? Back to being terrible. Gosh, what is going on? Hold on. Maybe it's because my son is using the microwave. Hold on a second. I'll tell him to leave. Elric, I think you're using the microwave and making noises over there is interfering with my mic. Okay. Well, I'm almost done with this. So maybe next one. Can you hear me better now?
Yes.
Okay. So the these mass demonstrations, they serve two purposes. One is to sort of show the world the power that the state has, right? Like, look at all my toys, right? And if you mess with us, we're going to use them on you, okay? But then they also have the purpose to show the people, the citizens of that state, right? Look at the power that we have. And if you try to betray us, if you become traitors, we will use these toys on you, right? So it's to also instill fear into the people as well, right? So did you guys get that? Okay. So one-party regimes will typically allow some kind of elections for internal stuffs, right? But typically you're just sort of like rubber stamping whatever that they're voting on, right? Um, so, you know, they're somewhat pointless, right? But they're not very competitive. Okay, of course. They're just sort of like this sort of circulation of elites. You know, do you want to vote for this person or that person? And it doesn't particularly matter, because then if one person doesn't make it, then the other person's going to be circulated in the next round, or you know what I mean? So it's just like whatever. The purpose is to demonstrate regime strength. And you're like, well, why if you're just rubber stamping? They want people to go out and vote because it provides legitimacy, right? So the more people that go out and show up to vote, they could say, well, you know, 90% of people, you know, voted, 95% of people voted, right? And that participation shows that they're giving people, you know, the power to vote or something like this. And it provides legitimacy, this sort of facade of legitimacy. Okay. And that's especially true in electoral authoritarian regimes, right? So they manipulate the electoral system, right? Oftentimes to ensure control. And this sort of facade of democratic legitimacy, it helps to overcome the dictator's dilemma, right? Because it gives them a better sense of, um, you know, when people are voting, what sort of, you know, what they can sort of like read the room, I guess you could say, right? Get a temperature for what's going on. And because even if they have to rig it or like get people to stuff ballots and stuff like that, they still know what's going on, right? So they kind of have a sense, right, of what's happening, even if um, it um, taints legitimacy because everybody knows what's happening, right? They could still say, oh, well, that's just, you know, fake news or whatever, right? It creates this facade of legitimacy. And really, that's all they care about is just the facade of legitimacy. So like in Russia, I think we talked about how like this is what this picture is of like people going to vote and like ballots were being stuffed and um, ballot boxes were being stuffed and these election reporters were, you know, filling out ballots, you know, and stuffing them in boxes. And you know, people would go to the booths and realize that their pens were erasable and they're not supposed to be, you know, things like that. And people were taking pictures of this and uploading them to YouTube, you know, or doing putting them on Twitter or, you know, whatever, right? And people were very angry about that. This is from the parliamentary election in 2011, the end of 2011 in Russia, these pictures. Parties, ruling party, they typically will emerge very early in the regime's history, right? Um, the purpose they serve is to provide greater stability and longevity to the regime, right? Because they will help create this sort of coalition around the regime and create an opportunity for patronage for the supreme leader to help buttress support, right? Opposition parties in electoral authoritarian regimes, they tend to be very limited. But again, they might be allowed some voice. We talked about that in the legislature. But again, you have to be careful because they can be the basis of resistance that might end up later toppling the regime. Okay. Civil society. We talked about what civil society was a couple of chapters back. In authoritarian societies, it's really circumscribed and repressed. You're not going to have much of it. State corporatism is most common. That's where if there's any civil society, it's run through the state, okay? Non-governmental organizations, when they exist in authoritarian regimes, they are willing to cooperate with the state. Okay, there's consultative authoritarianism that combines elements of liberal autonomy and state corporatism. They allow civil society groups to operate to improve overall governance by helping overcome the dictator's dilemma. Clientelism. This is really complex, and it varies by country and how it might look. So the weaker the institutions, the more important patron-client relations become, right? So as I was kind of talking about before, when you have a weak bureaucracy, when the institutions are weak, you're going to end up having more scenarios where you have people that are in bureaucratic positions and institutional positions because they are put there by these positions of patronage, etc. Or you might find situations where people who are in those positions are trying to get the bureaucracy to run, so they're doing things to try to, creating these sort of clientele type relationships to get things done, right? To try and get these institutions to run, okay? So informal networks will help provide citizens with access to government. Basically, it's how people get things done. So sometimes what you'll run into is that the institutions are just there's just so much bureaucracy, so much red tape, they just don't function well at all. And so people will try to find workarounds. So they create these informal networks with people who know people who know people, right, at, say, institutions that they need to deal with, like, the DMV or, the police department or whatever, right? And they might bribe people with like a bottle of vodka or, something like that to move to the head of the line so they don't have to wait weeks or, whatever for the thing that they need to do, um, you know, because it's just taking too long, whatever. Or if they've got, a hole on their property or something and their house is sinking and they need somebody to come out and inspect it, this kind of thing, right? So in Russia, they call this blat, okay? And it's this just sort of like informal network of people. It's this trust network. And was created to help get around institutions that just weren't functioning properly, okay? And it's kind of a corrupt system, right? But it was created because of corrupt and, you know, inept institutions that existed in the Soviet and before Tsarist system, right? And so people do that. They will be like, okay, who knows somebody down at, the water works, or who knows somebody, at the police department or whatever. And they, will get a hold of various people within their social network system, right? And find out, and well, what does that person want so that I can, go down there and take care of this thing. It's like just stuff that you and I would normally take for granted. Like, I've got to pay this parking ticket and I got to do it before, this time. But every time I go down there, the line is like so long and I've got to work. I've got to do, like, what do I do? Right. It's just getting things done. Right. And well, that person wants, a bottle of vodka, or this person wants, you know, um, they need a couple of shirts or something like that. Okay, well, and that's what you do. Or you happen to have something that you make or that you do, right, that you can trade a service for, or that you work at some other institution. And you could say, well, if you ever need anything, if that person ever needs anything at the institution that I work at, I'll remember this and I can help them later down the road, right? So there are things like that that people would do oftentimes in the system of blood, right? It's based on these interpersonal relationships fueled by corruption, bureaucracy, and the judiciary, like I was talking about. So the problem is that it can discourage collective action against the regime. So the Blahat system works so efficiently, right? It discourages people from like trying to actually fix the corruption itself, right? They're like, well, this is fine what we're doing. We're able to get the stuff done that we need done. We don't mind doing this. So who cares, right? And even after the fall of the Soviet Union, when the corrupt bureaucracy was still in place, I saw this. I was dealing with this myself into the early 2000s. Under Putin, trying to get things done like visas and things like that, and I had to partake in the Blot system in order to get stuff done too, because that was the way people were doing things, and you could not do stuff and get things done unless you did this, right? Unfortunately, it just wasn't going to work. But it discourages collective action against the regime. Like, it wasn't until people decided to finally change things that it was going to work. So unfortunately, it was this reduction in institutional trust that led to these parallel network structures, right? Nobody trusted the system, so they had to rely on one another to get things done. In China, it's a different system called Glucksani, and it works a little bit differently. Oh, I thought I had a page on that here. Oh yeah, Glucksani, yeah, right here, talks about it, and there's an article here if you're interested in it. China, growing participation, but no democracy. They have elections. They're competitive local elections to help, again, overcome the dictator's dilemma. There are parties, continued one-party rule, but changing party membership. The party membership is looking now to be more technocrats, entrepreneurs, and lawyers. Civil society, it's starting to expand some, but under a state corporatist system. Growing local protests, labor, unrest, and online activism, as well as NGOs, are starting to come around. The patron-client relationship, it's called Glucksani, like I said. Personal networks under communism and modernizing authoritarianism. This one's a little bit different. It's kind of based on personal relationships, as far as like, you take people to dinner, like it's like business relationships. Like, so, if you're interested in, working with somebody or something like this, you do all these things that would be kind of considered, or it would be definitely considered illegal here. Like, you would take them to dinner, you take them golfing, you do all these things with them, but you might be doing this with other people too that you're interested in working with, right? But only if you feel that you can trust the person, right, would you continue that relationship. So if you don't choose to, say, sign the contract with that person, right, it just means you didn't trust them, right? So accepting gifts, and it's common that if you want to work with somebody, you would send them gifts, right? Here, that would be considered like, kind of weird. Like, if you're bidding on a job or something, you shouldn't be sending gifts to somebody, or particularly a political, somebody running for office or something like that, right? But it's very common there. And not only is it common, it's expected. And if you don't do these things, you can't expect to, get certain jobs, or, rise up in certain positions and stuff. But anyway, there's more about this in this particular article here. Legitimation, it's based on growing economy and service provision. So the state is, getting its sense of legitimation from the economy, right? But of course, you have these issues from the outside related to right now, obviously, the coronavirus, but before you also had issues related to the Uyghurs and what's happening with them and the massive human rights violations that are occurring there that lots of people are very concerned about that the Chinese keep denying are happening. But anyway, last one, Russia, elections, weak opposition and electoral authoritarian regime. Elections, they're regular for parliament and president, but limited competition and growing fraud. Shift from mixed proportional representation to system of pure proportional representation, then back to mixed. We'll talk more about that, what that means later. So basically they just keep shifting how their parliament looks. But the main thing to take away from this one, this part of it, in relation to both elections and parties, is that the dominant ruling party with weak opposition parties, while they might have regular vote for president and for parliament and all of that stuff, the competition is very weak, okay, for both president and for parliament. While on book they have a multi-party system, it's a paper tiger. Like, I mean, it's just, or a paper house or whatever, a house of cards. It's just not really true. The main ruling party is, as you see there, it's United Russia, which is Putin's party. And any other parties that exist, the vast majority of them are really in name only. They will sometimes get up and voice some opposition, like in parliament, but then end up voting with United Russia. It's like they exist to provide legitimation for the notion of multi-parties, and plurality and all of this stuff. But at the end of the day, they, everybody knows that they're really just lackeys of United Russia. There's not really opposition. Even, unfortunately, what you would think the Communist Party would be an opposition in the parliament there, and it's not really. Civil society, weak organizations, but growing protests. Those have been growing quite a bit, and we're going to talk more about that, so I'll just hold on to that for a couple of chapters. Patron-client relationships, state use of oil revenue and ruling party to co-op support. Again, they have tons of oil, and they use that to, buy palatial mansions and all kinds of stuff, and we'll talk more about that in a couple of chapters, so hold on to that. Legitimation, ideology of state strength, order, and nationalism. Again, we'll talk more about that in a couple of chapters. So this is it for this particular chapter. I just wanted to kind of go through this really quickly, just to sort of give you a foundation, because I think talking about some of this is important to set us up for the next chapter of the Clark book, which is Democratic Transitions. Okay, so we have some of these ideas in mind so that we know what countries were transitioning themselves out from, right? And have some ideas to kind of work with from that regard. And then after that, we'll do another chapter about authoritarian regimes, and we'll talk a bit more about some of this stuff in the modern context. But anyway, anybody have any questions or thoughts?
I just wanted to ask, I know like Putin is an authoritarian leader, and he's like conservative, but like, do you think he's more like a benevolent dictator, or is like more like a tyrant? Like on what on the dictator scale? Because like,
Yeah.
like Kenya and India, I don't trust either governments, and like to me, like Kenya is definitely like dictatorship. But so like, I just want to ask you, like,
Right.
What,
So
what like level you like think about him as? Because like
I
I know like the apartment bombings, like you think it was a false flag, but like that's like it's like a controversial like topic. But apart from that, like because like the economy of Russia might be bad after the sanctions, like after like Crimea, but from where Putin came and now I think it's done pretty good. So like just want to ask you, like I know he's a dictator, but like from what skill? Like is he like a tyrant, like North Korea? Like you know what I'm
it's
saying?
not the level of, I would definitely say it's not the level of Saudi Arabia. I think that he sees himself as paternalistic.
Like a father figure, right?
Yes. Um, apartment bombings aside,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, I know, I know.
I mean, because there's no doubt that, you know, that happened. Um, but, you know, he sees himself as the only one who can save Russia and keep Russia from, falling apart. At
From
the
Western imperialism.
Right, yeah, I mean, and there's certain things to be said about that. I'm definitely, um I get that Western imperialism is a thing. I mean, I'm
I don't
definitely,
believe in it, but I think there are a lot of people who do.
no, I mean, I think that Western imperialism is a thing. I mean, look at, India, and look at, Latin America and Africa, and, all these things that have happened. But I think that, that Putin's perception of it in relation to Russia, is a bit skewed. And Western imperialism does not negate, um, the things that he does.
No,
Uh,
I understand.
you know what I
Like
mean? Like to Ukraine.
like even Ramzan Kadyrov, I don't agree. I don't agree with the guy. Like I think he lost it a bit. I don't know.
Who?
Ramzan Kadyrov.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. In Chechnya, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
Like
I think
Putin might portray himself as like normal, but I think Ramzan has like lost his screw. I
right,
don't know.
he definitely has, and I think that Putin has lost control of him.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think
I've seen that happen in India and in Kenya with the presidents and the leaders, like they're smaller guys, not putting them in control.
right. It just seems that he needed somebody to get a control of Chechnya because it was out of control. It was out of his hands. And he was able to kind of get it to its knees, through total
Yeah,
war. But he needed somebody to then hold the cap on, and he did that through his father initially, Kadyrov's father,
yeah,
and then Razam took control after his father's death. Um, so or one person after that, I guess. So anyway, I think that Putin sees himself as paternalistic, but I think he's also very paranoid about certain things in relation to the United States. Um, because I mean, we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but the United States really did want Russia to kind of be on, the democracy train. We did not want or need, Russia to be anti-democratic. We wanted to have a partner, to help, uh, you know,
especially after the Cold War. Yeah,
right, exactly. Like we really wanted, and because Russia had certain natural relationships with, say different countries in the Middle East and stuff like that from their Soviet
yeah,
ties, and it would have been really helpful, if we could have gotten them to help, from a diplomatic stand, for peace purposes and different things like that. So I mean, like look at how Bill Clinton and Yeltsin were all buddy buddy and like BFF and all that kind of stuff. Like that is kind of more the relationship that we were looking for versus the adversarial relationship that we have now. And I think that there were some things that the Americans did wrong, and a lot of things that Putin just willfully misinterpreted. But you know, I think that it's just a lot of just his worldview combined with the fact that he's vastly corrupt and he wants to hold on to his money and he's terrified of losing it. There's just a lot of different things going on with him.
I think Erdogan and Putin are both looking for like past glories, and
Right.
like the situation in Syria we're seeing is a cause of that. Like Syria and Turkey having like a fight over it. I think that's what it's about. Is that Putin wants like imperial Russia, and like Erdogan's looking for Ottoman, like
right.
the Ottoman Empire, maybe. I don't know.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's definitely, you know, an error to that in relation to Russia, and definitely with Erdogan also. You know, Putin definitely wanted to get back Crimea at some point. I don't think that, you know, the invasion was intended like he planned it on a specific day or anything like that. I think that he used the opportunistic. It was opportunistic, you know, like, oh, there's this, you know, uprising happening in Ukraine, so let's go do this now. We're going to take advantage. Yeah, we're going to take advantage of the chaos and just do this now, you know, because he's always made these various comments about that, you know, Crimea was, you know, that it was a mistake, you know, that Crimea was given to Ukraine, that it never should have happened. And, you know,
like you know, the Kashmir issue, like the Crimea issue and the Kashmir issue, to me, that like parallels. Just
right. Yeah.
different.
No, for sure. Definitely. That's definitely true, you know. And that situation in Kashmir, I mean, that's been blowing up lately, and a lot of people don't realize that as well. You know, and everything going on in India right now with Modi. What am I'm saying his name wrong? Prime Minister of Modi. That's right. I say Modi. I don't know why I said that.
No, it's all right. It's all right.
Modi. Yeah.
No,
I mean,
but I know it scares me. You know, India, I'm online, the Spanish influenza. Many people think it took it a generation backwards. So I don't know. It scares me. It scares me a bit.
Right. Yeah. But anyway, well, we'll talk more about this in 2 chapters, and we'll see what happens. And we can even talk about India and everything that's happening there too, because that's pretty relevant, you know, because they're taking a pretty serious authoritarian turn, which is kind of scary.
No, it is. My dad grew up in the emergency. He was in jail during that. I don't know if you've heard about it in India. It's called the emergency.
Oh, wow.
But like I understand 1%, but like 100%, but like it's good talking to you. You know, I like talking to people like who have a grasp on the globalist perspective. You know.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Lots of, it's, you know, I try to make sure that part's sort of included in some of this stuff, because people don't always.
Yeah, but in India's grammar. All right. Take care.
All right. Anybody else? If you got any questions, email me. Any concerns? Okay. And we'll. I'm putting up all the other lectures today. I was having some weird technical issue with my YouTube. So anyway, we'll talk to you soon, guys. Okay. Have a good one.
Thank you.
No problem. Bye. Where's my Zoom?